The concept of race or ethnicity in contemporary Singapore emerged from the attitudes of the colonial authorities towards race and ethnicity. Before the early 2000s, the four major races in Singapore were the Chinese, Malays, Indians and Eurasians. Today, the Chinese Malay Indian others model is the dominant organizing framework of race in Singapore. Race informs government policies on a variety of issues such as political participation, public housing and education. However, the state's management of race, as well as the relevance of the CMIO model, has been a point of contention amongst some in recent years. The practice of classifying the local population based on their races or ethnicities was born out of British colonial practices. Race categories were enshrined through local censuses and the issuance of identity cards. In the early British censuses of British Malaya, ethnic lines were often drawn by birthplace and linguistic or linguistic group. In these censuses, labels such as Hokkien, Boyanese, and Bengali were being used. In the 1891 census, races began to be grouped into broader categories such as Chinese, Malay, and Indian. Up till the 20th century, the largely first and second generation immigrant population retained strong ties to their respective homelands. These communities continued to be influenced by the ideological movements in their homelands. Such movements included the Chinese Civil War, the Indian independence movement, and the decolonization efforts in peninsular Malaya and Indonesia. As such, each immigrant community maintained their own sense of nationalism. When Singapore was part of the Federation of Malaysia from 1963 to 1965, interracial tensions were rife, culminating in incidents such as the 1964 race riots. At the same time, Singaporean political leaders such as Lee Kuan Yew began to advocate for a Malaysian Malaysia, opposing the Malaysian federal government's vision of an ethnic-based Malay Malaysia. After Singapore's split from Malaysia, the Singapore government pushed for the development of a Singaporean Singapore identity based on racial equality, with race acting as a secondary identifier alongside the Singaporean national identity. Special rights for Malays were legislated into the Singapore Constitution, symbolically recognizing the community as the indigenous people of the land. Singapore also formally adopted 4 official languages: English, Chinese, Malay and Tamil, and implemented a multilingual education policy. According to the Immigration and Checkpoints Authority, the child's race registered on their birth certificate can follow that of the child's father, mother, or an acceptable mixed race if the parents are of different races. The race field cannot be left blank during registration. If parents cannot decide on their child's race at the time of registration, the child's race is provisionally recorded as the father's. The option to record a child's race as double-barreled was introduced in 2010 by the Ministry of Home Affairs. Previously, mixed-race Singaporeans were allowed to choose between either of their parents' races, and no allowance was made for mixed-race children, with the exception of Eurasians. For relevant government policies, the first component of a double-barreled race is used. Singaporeans are allowed to change their race twice, once before the age of 21, and once at or after the age of 21. They would have to execute a statutory declaration stating their reason for the change, and undertaking not to change their race again. Racial equality and non-discrimination are set out in Article 12 of the Singapore Constitution, which states, 12. All persons are equal before the law and entitled to the equal protection of the law. Except as expressly authorized by this Constitution, there shall be no discrimination against citizens of Singapore on the ground only of religion, race, descent or place of birth in any law or in the appointment to any office or employment under a public authority or in the administration of any law relating to the acquisition, holding or disposition of property or the establishing or carrying on of any trade, business, profession, vocation or employment. This article does not invalidate or prohibit any provision regulating personal law, or any provision or practice restricting office or employment connected with the affairs of any religion, or of an institution managed by a group professing any religion. to persons professing that religion. The Constitution also recognizes the special position of Malays as the indigenous people of the land in Article 152. 152. It shall be the responsibility of the government constantly to care for the interests of the racial and religious minorities in Singapore. The government shall exercise its functions in such manner as to recognize the special position of the Malays, who are the indigenous people of Singapore, and accordingly it shall be the responsibility of T.